Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today is just an audio only episode because I am on location, not in my studio / living room. And I've got some great articles for you today. So this first one comes from the University of Utah and was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's a peer-reviewed, legitimate, thoroughly researched subject and article, and the title reads, Early Humans Evolved in Ecosystems Unlike Any Found Today. So one issue with studying mammals and animals in the fossil record, starting at around 700,000 to about 1 million years ago, is not a lot of attention and focus was paid onto the actual environment. A lot of the environment that is known, all the environmental data and climate data and all the conditions and stuff kind of follows a gradualistic type of perspective, which basically in a nutshell, they think 700,000 to 1 million years ago, it was more or less the same as it was today. Although I did an episode about the Green Sahara, and they do take into account desertification and dry spells and stuff like that. But not a lot was focused on mammals in particular and their direct relationship with the environment and also their biology. So anyway, we'll talk more about this in a second. To understand the environmental pressures that shaped human evolution, scientists must first piece together the details of the ancient plant and animal communities that our fossil ancestors lived in over the past 7 million years. So, like I said, there are these communities of animals and ancient plant or the environment of starting around 7 million all the way up until about 1 million to 700,000 years ago is when things started to really change. And this is a really fascinating article because that means humans, let's just take the 700,000 year date. Humans at that time, so Neanderthals are thought to have arisen back then. Homo erectus was already in full swing. Denisovans were thought to have followed a few 100,000 years after that, as well as archaic Homo sapiens. Their ecosystem was vastly different than ours, but was gradually becoming what the modern environment was like. The whatever you want to call it, the modern hegemony of plant life, whatever it is. So they were living at a turning point, which is very fascinating because a lot of the fossil record in terms of humans, modern humans, anatomically modern humans, seems to be that we branched off around that time. So that climate regime back then must have something must have happened essentially. And there are a lot of different theories out there. There are some wide-ranging theories. One of the most out there theories is the stoned ape theory, where I think it was Terence McKenna who proposed that. Basically, the stoned ape theory comes from the hypothesis that the rainforests receded and these savannas took over, and that's basically the crux of the change in the regime there, the plant and climate regime. So anyway, a study led by University of Utah scientists calls into question such approaches and suggests that the vast majority of human evolution occurred in ecosystems unlike found today. So again, this goes to diet, this goes to evolution and how nutrition figures into that. So to test for differences between modern and ancient environments, the researchers analyzed a data set of more than 200 present-day African mammal communities and more than 100 fossil communities spanning the past 7 million years in East Africa, a time period encompassing all of human evolution. So this is a pretty suitable location for them to gather all their data. Makes sense why they would pick East Africa here. They found that prior to 700,000 years ago, mammal communities looked far different from those today. So one example they cite are the fossil communities supported by greater diversity of mega herbivores, which is basically like elephants and animals along those lines, species over 2,000 pounds, mega herbivores. So this is very important to this entire thought, because mega herbivores, they are animals that have a direct effect on the environment, meaning that they eat everything out there. They're basically their survival, and if they thrive, it'll directly set the environmental tone of the area. So the patterns of grass and leaf-eating species fluctuating in abundance around 1 million years ago, fossil communities began transitioning to a more modern makeup, which the author suggests is the outcome of long-term grassland expansion coupled with arid climate pulses. So I mentioned desertification earlier. There were some catastrophic climate pulses, so meaning that the result of that was this desertification effect, and the grasslands started expanding more and more, meaning the diversity of the vegetation was disappearing with alarming speed at around 1 million years ago. This is when it started happening. So another thing the paper adds is that scientists need to critically reevaluate our understanding of ancient ecosystems, and I touched on that earlier. Ancient ecosystems were way different than they are now, and not enough attention is paid to this, and that must be a important cog or important piece to understand the early human evolution. Because early human evolution is very, very up in the air. There's a lot of this just happened out of nowhere type of thinking, and there's no further investigation. But now the ecosystems had to have been a factor, diet had to have been a factor, as well as catastrophic changes and all these different things. So Tyler Faith is the curator of archaeology at the Natural History Museum of Utah, and this is what he says. He says, for a long time, our field has been trying to pin down how environmental changes influence human evolution, but we've got to be able to reconstruct past environments right in the first place. So he's saying that we can't go further in investigating human evolution and ancient environmental changes unless we're able to accurately reconstruct what the past environment was like. And he's saying that is very, very vague right now, and that's the whole goal of this study, is to get closer to that truth. If we continue to reconstruct ancient environments on the basis of modern African ecosystems, we are likely missing an entire realm of possibilities in how past ecosystems functioned, and understanding their function is key, because that way we can extrapolate from the data. We can create more and more accurate models of what was going on back then, and then we can have better hypotheses, a better reconstruction of the past, and from there we can use logic and further research to pinpoint exactly what to focus on, and so we can try to explain what happened. Because like Graham Hancock says, we are a species with amnesia, and this memory could go back up to 1 million years ago when these changes occurred. So again, East Africa is a boon for mammal fossils. It's the most abundant. It's a place with mammal fossils going as far back as 7 million years, with a lot of data to delve into. This extensive database of both ancient and modern mammal communities, the researchers focused on 3 traits: diet, body size, and digestive strategy. We talked about diet and body size a little bit, but digestive strategy is a big one. So they found, for all these traits, they found that the makeup of ancient herbivore communities differs significantly from those today. So herbivores directly shape the structure of the ecosystems, and that it has kind of like a domino effect of everything else, all the biodiversity, all the biomass of the continent. And here's a little graphic here. So on the left are the geographic distribution of the modern and fossil herbivore communities. On the right, you can see there's some Holocene here, but the Pleistocene, you can see there's more continuity, and then Pliocene, there's even more. They're more bunched up. So basically, with the more close you get to the modern age, which is the Holocene right now, the communities are less diverse. They're less spread out. or they're a little bit more spread out, except right here in Kenya. And they didn't really live as close to each other as the previous epochs, the Pleistocene, Pliocene, and Miocene. And that is very interesting, and it'll make more sense as we continue. So large herbivores aren't just passive parts of an ecosystem. We know that they can shape the landscape. They're eating plants, they're knocking down trees, trampling soil, etc. All this influences vegetation structure, fire regimes, nutrient cycling, and impacts other organisms, including humans. So this part right here has been, I think it's been known, but it hasn't been largely investigated just because it's been taken for granted and not thought about deeply enough. Fire regimes and nutrient cycling, all of these are part of, you guys have all learned in grade school that there is some sort of cycle, the ecosystem cycle. You guys know about the water cycle. There are all kinds of cycles. There's so many moving parts going on in any given ecosystem that it would be foolish to think that over 1 million years ago, set between 7 to 1 million years ago, that things worked the same as they did now. Although back then there were way more giant animals. They're different. The food chain was different. And it just makes sense that they were following different rules of the ecosystem, if you want to think of it that way. So one example they give is modern African ecosystems are dominated by ruminants. So this is a term that basically refers to cows and antelopes and other animals that have 4 compartments in their stomachs, which serve to thoroughly break down food. So that means they can eat and get the most nutrients out of what they're eating, so they don't have to eat as much. Non-ruminants equipped with the same simple stomachs are comparatively rare, with at most 8 species coexisting in the same area today. So there are way less of them now than there were back in the day, millions of years ago. So some non-ruminants include elephants, zebras, hippos, rhinos, pigs, etc. And you can think of them like digestive conveyor belts. So they're just constantly eating. They eat larger quantities of plants to make up for their inefficient digestion. So this idea of ruminants and non-ruminants is very critical to understand exactly what this research is trying to suggest. And again, non-ruminants were ruling the day 700,000 plus years ago. And then, in contrast to the present-day pattern, East African fossil records document landscapes rich in non-ruminant communities. So again, these species were coexisting in the same area, which means when we go back to this here, you can see that there are more bunches of these communities living closer together back then than they are now. So again, they're vastly different in terms of body size. That means the bigger the body, the more they had to eat, the more nutrients they needed. Fossil records document lots more mega herbivores than their modern counterparts. There's been a steady decline of these mega herbivores beginning 4.5 million years ago until about 700,000 years ago, which is a lot more similar to the modern distribution. Very, very interesting here. So what is the impact of these eating machines all living together in the same place, when it's not the case today? So the ancient herbivore communities were probably consuming far more vegetation, which means less fuel for wildfires. Because fire is an important part of modern ecosystems in Africa and favors grasslands over woodlands, is going to fundamentally alter how things are working at the level of entire ecosystems, starting with the plant communities. So less fuel, there's less stuff to burn in these wildfires. So again, something must have happened that favored these grassland ecosystems, and because there's less woodlands, that means there's less for these non-ruminants to eat, and ergo less survival rates for them. And slowly but surely there will be these ruminants will come up which thrive on just eating grass and what's left of these wildfires, essentially. And this goes into what Terence McKenna was saying, that he thought for some reason that the rainforests and these woodland regimes were retreating and the savannas were taking over. And he didn't talk about ruminants and non-ruminants, obviously, but he was onto something there. And from there, he goes into the rise of humans and stuff like that. I don't know how true that is. There's not there, but although there should be a lot more research into that as well, just because there is a parallel here with this hard science. Paleontologists have been aware of that, but until now, no one's really tried to measure just how different the past was compared to the present. So what drove these shifts in mammal communities over the past 7 million years? So the expansion of grassland throughout the past 4 million years is the main culprit. Mega herbivores preferred wooded environments, whereas ruminants thrive in wide open savannas. We just talked about that. The fossil record closely follows the shifting environments with changes in representation of these groups, tracking long-term grassland expansion. So there are two sources of evidence that are basically saying the same thing. In the fossil record, these mega herbivores were disappearing as the climate was shifting. So around 1 million years ago, this becomes incredibly apparent because fossils show a shift in mammal community dietary structure that grassland expansion alone failed to explain. So when the non-ruminants dominated East African ecosystems, and when they started to decline, it corresponded to these pulses of climate drying, okay, which were bore out in these marine dust records. So what this means, basically, they didn't have reliable access to water. A lot of these non-ruminant species were disappearing alongside the rivers and lakes that they were depending on. So not only were they disappearing, these waterways and these water systems were changing, and some of them disappeared completely. So you do the math. If they don't have access to this water, then it's more than likely than not these animals will disappear as well with these disappearing waters. The conveyor belt eating strategy of non-ruminants relied on accessing abundant vegetation, again, which would have declined during these periods of drought. And again, this coincides with the grassland data and the retreating woodlands. And so here's the big advantage we have today, and then we'll end it here. We're in the era of big data, meaning we can summon all this information at our fingertips instantaneously, and then we can create graphs and all these different visual representations and maps and satellite data. All of these things we have access to now, and that speeds up this research process. So this guy from Colorado State University, he's saying, with the assembly of large comprehensive data sets, we can now ask important questions that are fundamentally different from those asked in the past. We can go deeper, basically, with our research. We can investigate larger scale patterns and dynamics that undoubtedly influence the course of human evolution. So this is basically the start of a hole that we're digging to get to the truth of human evolution. So what guys like McKenna were saying, they were laughed out of the room. They're even laughed out of the room today, although McKenna died 19 years ago. But this is a door that will lead down this corridor of truth along our investigation of human history and human evolution. And this is a big piece of the puzzle. So something definitely happened with the environment rather instantaneously, depending on what you think the difference of 300,000 years between 1 million to 700,000 years ago. If you think 300,000 years is a long time, I think it's a blink of an eye when you take into account the entire history of the Earth. Something rather relatively instantaneous happened, and then you have the rise of humans. Make of that what you will, but that is something that requires a lot more investigation and looking into recreating these ancient Pleistocene and Pliocene, Miocene environments is a huge step in that direction of getting closer to the truth. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll have another one up tomorrow. I think I didn't have time at all this week, so it's been about 6 days since I posted. But please continue to like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment. And thanks for listening.